Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Hello, I'm Chris William, and welcome once again to Carolina Business Review, the most widely watched program on Carolina business and public policy. Last week, it was part one about the relationship between first-time mothers and children, and what does that have to do with the success of the Carolinas broadly. The program we are talking about, one of the programs, is Nurse-Family Partnership. We're going to continue that dialogue from the social standpoint. Stay with us.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded January 10th, 2014. On this week's program, Robin Britt of Guilford Child Development, Ursula Douglas of Care Ring, Rhett Mabry from the Duke Endowment, Dr. Amy Picklesheimer from the South Carolina Birth Outcomes Initiative, and Joe Waters of the Institute for Child Success.
Hello, welcome again to our program, part two of the Nurse-Family Partnership and the relationship early on in a child's life. Joe, we're going to start with you. The social implications of getting it right for a child early on, earlier than being just ready for school, is got to be funded somehow. And I guess that's kind of where the rubber meets the road too. And that's where the debate happens. How do you fund all these programs? Mental health gets talked about, education, economic development, workforce development, the list goes on, but you have to fight your way to get funding for things like NFP or Nurse Family Partnership. What are some unique ways to find the money to get these programs not just off the ground, but successful? And so legislators and those who make public policy actually do take notice and say, wait a minute, this might be a good return on investment.
Right, Chris. Well, that's absolutely a critical challenge for the success of these programs. And we've been exploring one particular approach known as pay-for-success financing. It's a new approach for scaling proven social programs that have proven impacts, but also save government's money. It involves partnerships between private investors, either philanthropic or commercial, the government, which is willing to pay for outcomes when success is achieved, and impartial evaluators who measure the success of the program with the service provider like NFP. And so we're interested in how you can use pay-for-success financing to really solve a problem for governments, which is money is tied up in remediation and rehabilitation and not invested in prevention that can have long-term benefits.
Let me ask you something, because you're using terms that bankers use, that finance people use. You're talking about investment, pay for success. If you're asking for money, are we talking about writing grants and asking for gifts philanthropically, or is this some type of return? Is this a direct return on investment? How does this work?
Well, pay for success is an emerging model. It's an emerging asset that banks are making investments in. Goldman Sachs has made an investment in New York City's pay for success project, also known as a social impact bond, focused on the reduction of recidivism. Bank of America has made an investment in New York State's project, which was just announced in the last couple of weeks. We're exploring how this model of pay-for-success financing is applicable to Nurse Family Partnership in South Carolina. We've done a feasibility study. It's feasible. There's unmet need in South Carolina where we could scale up Nurse Family Partnership if the financing became available. And the state is exploring it. An RFI was released back in September, and that began the explorations on the part of the state.
Okay, so let me be even more clear. So South Carolina, and I want to put words in your mouth, but South Carolina is going to float bonds to the public to finance the social nature of what NFP does. I'm sorry.
Sure.
So I could buy a bond with the same type of, my money will be returned to me, I'll get an interest rate, and it'll have some type of credit quality to it.
Right. Well, these are technically not bonds. A better way to think of them is that they're working capital loans for high-performing nonprofit organizations.
With all those other attributes about the investor gets the money back.
Right, absolutely.
Interesting.
And that's right. Those investments that are being made in these across the country, investors are anticipating making some sort of return and having social impact.
The key to that, though, Chris, is that the intervention has to produce the outcomes that have the economic consequences. And so part of the structure is you get agreement on the front end with government to say, here are the outcomes we think this intervention can produce. Here are the economic benefits that can accrue from those outcomes, and then you basically calculate the savings, which go back to the investors.
So you can actually you could statistically articulate the outcomes to have a return to a bondholder here?
Basically, the outcomes in the case of Nurse Family Partnership, we've got confidence that if we deliver the model as intended, we can achieve certain outcomes that we're willing to be held accountable to. And then we, the investors, and then if we produce those outcomes, you have to make assumptions, but we can agree to how you calculate the cost savings. That process, if you have it on the front end with government, then you put forth the private dollars to take the intervention deeper into the communities, hopefully producing the outcomes that we want to be held accountable to and calculating the savings. If we don't produce these outcomes, the investors don't get repaid. So the government's not at risk there, the private investor's at risk.
Well, and that's the key. Robin, you spent time in the halls of Congress. You were a congressman from North Carolina. You know a little bit about Health and Human Services at HHS in North Carolina. I mean, does this make sense? Is this something that we could see North Carolina with a AAA credit rating floating social impact bonds?
It makes all the sense in the world. Here's the reason it makes sense. It's very hard to change your service delivery system. You've got constituencies out there. When I left Raleigh, one of my impressions was we're spending much more now. We're spending billions of dollars on these services. We don't really know if they work or not. That's why this movement toward evidence-based services, evidence-based programs is so important. We've got to be able to say, we know if we put dollars in this program, it's going to work. What does this do? It takes the risk off government, puts the risk on the investors. Mm-hmm. They're not going to fund a program that's not going to work because they're going to lose money. Mm-hmm. They're going to go in and do the research and go behind that and make darn sure that if they put the money up front, they're going to get it back with some return because they don't want to lose money on this investment. So it is makes a lot of sense. It's very hard to change the constituency-based services we have. This is one way to do it.
Joe, how do you know you can sell those bonds in South Carolina? How do you know that investors will buy those bonds?
Well, as part of our feasibility work with Megan Golden from New York University in South Carolina, we talked with investors who are already in this space and investors who are looking to get in this space. And they've shown a real commitment because this makes a lot of sense for them. Just as they do due diligence on other investments, when they do due diligence on Nurse Family Partnership, they see that NFP achieves outcomes. As Amy talked about earlier, the national supports, the fidelity to the model, there's consistency there in achieving those outcomes. Investors are thrilled to see that with a social program like NFP, and when they're looking to make investments and pay for success projects, NFP is a very strong candidate.
Yeah, Amy, I want to ask you and Ursula something. You hear this talk, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to again put words in your mouth, but how do you find? And I don't mean you per se, Amy, and you, Ursula, but how do you scale the talent part of this? Sure, you get $15 million from social impact bonds in South Carolina. How do you go out and find the right bench talent that can deliver and do the program according to the stringent rules of NFP?
I think the personnel is the key to success here because this is an intervention.
The personnel meaning the
nurses,
OB and
the nurses
and the RNs.
that are in the houses talking to these girls every day. You have to have the absolute best people that you can find. I think paying them an appropriate wage for what they're doing is important. If you cut corners there, the model starts to fall apart. Some communities in the more rural areas in particular have challenges because there's fewer pregnant women that are in those communities, and there's fewer nurses that are working there too that are willing to go out and do home visitation. So developing a talent pool of people that can do this job is important. And when you look at it on a statewide implementation, having a larger community like Greenville or Mecklenburg be able to mentor more rural communities I think is also an important component of success. So that's one of the things I think that can make social impact bonds for nurse-family partnership work in a place like South Carolina or North Carolina, that we have large cities with proven successful programs that have been in existence for years that are able to offer their expertise, local expertise, in addition to the national support.
You know, we've talked a lot about the financing, and I'd like to spend more time, but I really want to get to more of the social part of this. Robin and Red, I'd like to ask you both this. Amy just talked about the concentration of the critical mass in places like the upstate and places like Charlotte, Mecklenburg, and you could even make the argument about Wake County and the Triangle. There are more than one or two rural areas in the Carolinas. How, and I've got to think some of the most critical issues are in those places, that sometimes they don't even see the light of day, virtually, not literally. How do you argue that point? How do you get to the rural parts as much as the urban?
Technology may be one way. You know, they're doing interviews now. I saw that some psychiatrists were doing interviews with long distance telemedicine and that sort of thing. So it may be that in those bi-weekly visits and sometimes weekly visits the nurses make, that they can do that by some type of interface. So they can make fewer visits. Now, you've got to make enough visits to have that relationship and that sort of thing. I'm not saying curtailing them dramatically, but I think that's one way that we can look at the rural piece of that.
Chris, I think another one of the strengths of NFP is that it builds on existing structures that are local. So even in some of these rural communities that have fewer resources, there are still programs there and strengths there that are working to help families that are living on the edge. And so when you bring a new program like NFP into a community, you can begin referring those families to existing programs within the community already. You don't have to start from scratch. So we can build on the strengths that are already existing.
You know, okay, so Rhett,
well, but Chris, I think you've hit upon a challenge for NFP and frankly for a lot of social services, and that is how do you structure programs like this in an efficient way so that they can provide services in more of our more remote communities, because you've got greater driving distances to families, you're going to have fewer families. And one of the things the social impact bonds may help to do, if it actually occurs in South Carolina, is help us understand that better and try to test solutions using technology and other strategies.
Outside of New York, is South Carolina the first site to do this?
So there's a New York City project, a New York State project, and there's also an early childhood proof of concept pilot social impact project in Utah in the Granite School District that's focused on scaling up a high quality preschool program.
Too early to get any kind of results or orients?
Well, we're getting results from the United Kingdom, which has been at this a little longer than we are. Peterborough Prison has had a project focused on recidivism reduction, and the results, interim results, granted, are positive. They're seeing success. Fewer folks coming out of prison are going back.
Do you think, and final question, I know I already said that we were going to move on past this, final question is, and anyone can answer this, would the success of a social impact bond embolden legislators to be more bold about public dollars into this program?
I think this helps legislators because it allows them to bring new capital into the state to scale a proven program that a lot of them would love to fund, but we just don't have the dollars to do it. And it allows government to only pay when outcomes are achieved. So that outcome accountability dimension of pay for success financing is of great interest to legislators because they know we're paying for programs all the time and we don't know if they're having results or not. So to be able to say we're only going to pay when outcomes are achieved is exciting for legislators.
One of the things it does is it gives government a some information to start redirecting resources. As Robin said, we put a lot of money into programs that have been there for a long time without really knowing whether it's having impact. What this allows us to do is almost run a parallel program with private dollars, document the effect, and then creates a scenario where it's going to be easier for government to start retargeting, redirecting dollars toward more effective programs.
You know, and we are gonna move on, but I suspect there's probably gonna be more than a passing interest if you could get investors to do social investing through this way, and especially back in their community, and certainly more to come on that. Ursula.
Yes.
You know, you see the whites of the eyes of the parents. You hold their hand, or the mother. You hold their hand. You cry with them. I'm sure you laugh with them. You go through, you know, those ups and downs. I can only imagine what that relationship is like. I want to ask you a couple things. Okay. How do you know, we've talked about first-time mothers and helping those children. Where's the father in this relationship? And it's got to have an impact. Either the father being there or the father not being there. How does that factor into this?
Well, Chris, in some of our communities, there is an increased trend in fathers not being present. But I also think that there's a misconception that there are fathers who don't want to be involved. I think that we have to take a hard look at some of the challenges that the families face that they need our support in, and giving fathers tools as well. We provide a lot of support, Nurse Family Partnership does, to the mother. We also really promote the father being involved as much as possible. And we do have a lot of father participation in some of our homes.
And Amy, I know this is sensitive, and you start talking about social issues, and you start talking, you know, getting into inter-family relationships. How do you feel about that? How do you get the father engaged here, the first-time father? That would seem like it's almost as critical.
Well, I think that's one of the secrets of going out and doing home visits. You can really see our clients in their environment, and with some of them, the fathers bring a really positive element to the family and can contribute to raising children. In other homes, there may not be such a positive influence from either the father of the baby or other friends that are around her. And looking at the social context for that mother and her child is one of the most important elements of the program, to help these girls have insights into the direction their lives are headed and the environment, social and otherwise, that they're trying to raise these children. So one of our goals is to help them be thoughtful about that.
And as NFP inserts itself into a very new and a very tender relationship here. The other thing you have is, and you cannot legislate this, and I would encourage anyone to jump in here. How do you, not compel, but maybe how do you encourage things like self-respect, honesty, and let me go far as to say this, and I'm sure I'm going to get emails about this, but faith. I mean, a majority of our communities have a faith belief. That also has to play a role, doesn't it?
Well, I think another one of the most important elements about NFP is that it's really family-centered. So we talk a lot about patient-centered medical care, where you tailor the medical decision-making to the individual patient's beliefs. And I have a number of clients whose faith is a critically important element of their life, and to not address that with them would be shortchanging them or leaving out a very important element of their decision making. So NFP is incredibly flexible. The clients get to choose the topics that are the most important to them within the curriculum, and we can choose as providers how much to engage their faith beliefs and encourage them in those directions. So all of the elements that you're mentioning are completely important, and when you talk about the life course of the mother and her economic self-sufficiency, you can't get there without engaging some of those personal beliefs. And this program gives us the flexibility to engage those clients on that level, and that's why the relationship with the nurses and the quality of the nurses is so important. It ends up being a very intense relationship, and Ursula can has better insights into that than even I do.
You have to be very circumspect on that topic.
In what way, Rob?
Well, it's obviously there's many faiths, and you have to be very, very careful. But the most important thing to me about faith is what you role model and what you demonstrate. It's not what you say as much as who you are. And when that nurse comes in a nurturing, caring way and moves mountains for this mom, that by itself is a tremendous impact on the life of that young mother.
Joe, Rhett, you're... quiet on
You
this
know,
issue.
I guess I would just say NFP is not a panacea. It's not going to cure all society's ills. What it is going to do is going to help that mother to understand what her goals are for herself and for her child. It's going to give her a pathway toward achieving those goals. And if that involves strengthening their faith, then I think it helps there. If that involves getting the child ready for school, it helps in that regard. So you have to take the mothers where they are. You have to get them to understand that there is a future for both the child and the mother. And then you have to help them move in that direction with assistance. And I think that's what these nurses do.
Right, it's very client focused. We really build off the strengths and the interest of the mother, helping her to follow her heart's desire. We have clients, like Robin mentioned, who are very faith oriented, and we have families where that is not so much of a focus. But it's important to us as nurses in building a very powerful relationship that can motivate positive change to meet that client where they are and to build off what's important to them.
And you know, I want to say this as a disqualifier for those of you that are watching. This is part two of this very unique relationship of a first-time mother and a child, and a newborn, if you will, and how that relationship reverberates out into things like economic development and graduation rates and incarceration rates and so on and so forth, and how we can get this early in the process. And we've been talking about nurse-family partnership, but we use, and I say we on this program, we used NFP as a proxy for living in that world. So let me ask you all this question. As NFP talks about successes and struggles with the clients and the families, how do you interact with the wider industry that you're in? Because there has to be, and I say this respectfully, there has to be territorial issues here. There's got to be a United Way or a one-off program or some type of program out there that does the exact same thing and maybe does it through a different nonprofit, or maybe it's a commercial venture. So how do you to remain as inclusive as anything? And Robin, let's start with you, since you.
Well, the first thing is collaboration,
But how do you do that? Because we all talk about that.
Well, first of all, you identify the resources in the community that can benefit this mom. You're going to be making referrals to them, but you're also going to be working with those other agencies that are providing services. And so there's no one doing exactly what Nurse Family Partnership does. So, and you tie those together, and so you try to form a mosaic of services. You know, a mom may have 5 or 6 case managers. Well, there needs to be an alignment of that. So I think the first thing on this is collaboration. The second thing, going back to our earlier discussion, is we need to have programs that work. We cannot continue to fund programs that don't have outcomes. So evidence-based is a coming development where the expectation is, this is on the part of foundations, it's on the part of government. Show us the outcomes. Show us that what you're saying you're going to do for this family, whatever it is going to actually happen. And we want to see your outcomes. And that's a positive development because we do spend a lot of money. We've got to make sure it works.
And that's where we started as a funder, as a foundation, the Duke Endowment. We wanted to take that intervention that we thought had the most credible evidence. And I think it's widely accepted that Nurse Family Partnership has that. We want to try to get that established in our 2 states so that it's provided to those mothers who want to receive the service. And then we want to build out the continuum with other services, other home visiting programs that begin to complement and serve different mothers. But we felt like instead of trying to do all of it at once, we had to start with maybe a cornerstone and then build from there. And that's our thought process.
Joe, how do you do that? How do you do the same thing in your world?
Well, our partnership with folks across South Carolina has suggested that NFP is really very strongly positioned to do exactly what Rhett just described in terms of finding a foothold here in the Carolinas and growing out from there. Certainly there are folks who are implementing other home visiting models. There are also other family strengthening programs, a number of programs in the early childhood space. But back to Robin's point, what we're interested in are the outcomes. And what are the programs that have evidence to support the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve for children here in the Carolinas? Those are the programs that we're going to be promoting. NFP is one of them. It's certainly critical. And I think also the way that NFP is implemented and the support around the implementation of NFP is itself a model for other other programs that are seeking to replicate NFP's success.
You know, Joe, you get the last word on that. And let me thank you all for being soldiers on this one, because I know it's a hard sell sometimes, and you look way down the road and try to make your case, and I can tell you're all passionate about it. Thank you for being on this program, and again for traveling. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for articulating it, and good to see you all. Hope you'll come back and see how those bonds have been floated in the market. Until next week, I'm Chris William. We certainly hope your business is good. Go to our website if you have any comments, but if not, thank you and good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.